But before we dive into the disturbing tales of the night, let me ask you, do you have the courage to stay until the end? Most viewers don't subscribe to the channel, perhaps out of oversight, or perhaps because after hearing these stories, they never slept the same way again. If you think you can handle it, click subscribe now. My name is Mike Thompson, and for over 10 years, I've been driving the streets of Portland, Oregon as a taxi driver. I've seen it all. Drunks throwing up in the back seat, couples arguing, forgetful people trying to remember their home address. But there's one fare that messed me up so badly that to this day I avoid driving at night. It was early November. Cold, damp, that typical Northwest kind of night. Low fog and streetlights illuminating little more than the steam on the asphalt. My shift usually runs from 5 in the afternoon until around 2 in the morning, when the downtown traffic dies down and you can pick up some passengers leaving the bars or the bus station. That night, around 11:30 p.m., a lady flagged me down on Burnside Street, almost near Old Town. She looked to be about 60 years old, maybe older. She was wearing a long coat, one of those thrift store finds, and carrying a huge, somewhat worn-out sports bag, clearly heavy. She asked me how much I charged to take her to the old part of the Lads Addition neighborhood. I said it was by the meter, and she got in without arguing. During the ride, something about her bothered me. She kept looking out the window, her hand clutching the strap of the bag tightly. You could see her thin, pale fingers trembling slightly. The silence in the car was only broken by the sound of the tires on the wet street, and from time to time, the crackling of the dispatch radio. We arrived on a dark residential street, full of old Victorian houses. Most of them had their lights off. I thought it was strange, but she insisted that was the place. She paid correctly, got out with difficulty carrying the huge bag, and disappeared behind a rusty gate. I went back to the busy area, drove around a bit more, thinking about ending the night. That's when, in front of a bar in the Pearl District, a young guy called me. He was kind of drunk, got in quickly and sat right on the seat where the lady had been. As he adjusted his seatbelt, he bumped something with his foot and commented, "Hey man, did someone forget a bag here?" I looked in the rearview mirror. It was the same bag as the woman's. That gave me a strange chill. How the heck did she forget that heavy thing? I waited for the guy to get out, parked near a 24-hour gas station, and went to check. Maybe I'd find a document, an address, anything to return it. All the compartments of the bag were empty, but in the main compartment, well, that's where the surprise came. Inside, there were parts of a mannequin, arms, legs, a torso, plastic. But the first impression was horrible. The pieces were dirty, scratched, as if they had been dragged or used wrongly. I closed it quickly, a little nervously laughing, a little disturbed. I didn't want to keep that thing. I decided to go back to Lads Addition the next day, try to find the woman, and return it. I got home around 2 a.m. I live alone in a duplex on SE Division. I put the taxi in the garage as always, locked everything, not just the car, but the padlocks on the gate as well. I left the bag on the back seat, locked the car, and went to sleep. The next day, I left the house around 10:30 a.m., and that's when my heart froze. The mannequin was assembled in the back seat, perfectly assembled, sitting as if it were a regular passenger, the painted eyes staring straight ahead. But what really messed me up was the doll's face. The smile seemed too weird, forced, as if someone had tried to make a human face, but had failed grotesquely. I stood at the entrance to the garage, the cold wind hitting my face, just staring at that. The doors were still locked, no signs of forced entry, nothing. It took me a few minutes to be able to open the car, and I decided right then and there that I needed to return that thing immediately. I take a few deep breaths before opening the door of the taxi. The mannequin is there, impeccably assembled, sitting as if it's waiting for the light to turn green. The plastic face white, but with that smile. My God, that smile. Forced, too wide, and the painted eyes seemed alive for a second, even knowing that it was impossible. What's most disturbing? I had left the bag closed, the pieces disassembled. The doors were locked. My garage too. Who or what assembled that? Just opening the door and smelling that cold vinyl mixed with a slight odor of dampness makes me nauseous. I know I shouldn't, but I avoid looking at the mannequin for too long, as if making eye contact was some kind of invitation, but I need to solve this. I decide that I'm going back to the exact place where I left the woman the night before, in Ladd's Addition. It's a neighborhood with those all-winding streets. Victorian houses too old for the big city, huge trees shedding leaves on the ground, as if time had stopped there. I drive there, avoiding looking in the rearview mirror. I don't want, in any way, to face that thing following me in the back seat. It's like the atmosphere in the car is dense. The silence doesn't help. Not even the taxi radio seems to pick up a signal properly. Just low crackling and shapeless murmurs. I arrive on the street where I left the lady. That same street where only the dark houses watched me. I park slowly and stay there, waiting for some movement. The clock marks 11 a.m., but the street seems deserted. Not even a dog, not even a person walking. The damp leaves on the ground make a strange sound when the wind passes. I lean on the hood of the car, arms crossed, trying to see if anyone appears. Minutes pass. Nothing. Until, almost without warning, I see a figure turning the corner. It's her, the woman from the night before, walking slowly, long coat, looking at the ground. But there's something different about her now. The expression is more tired, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. When she gets closer, I raise my hand to call attention. "Ma'am, last night you forgot something in my taxi." She stares at me for a second, eyes deep, and I notice that she seems to hesitate. You can see it in the way she looks discreetly at the car. "I didn't forget," she says low, almost a whisper. That gives me a knot in my stomach. "Look, I don't know what you've been messing with, but that thing is assembled in the back seat of my car now. I want to return it. I don't want that with me." She takes a deep breath, then looks around, as if she were checking if anyone was listening. And then she simply says, "My husband died last year. My daughter took that to a woman in Salem. They said she could bring him back, but he never came back. It wasn't him, it was something else. Something that got stuck there. I tried to leave that thing anywhere. I needed to get rid of it." She stares at me directly, her eyes wide, almost as if begging me to understand. "You shouldn't have opened the bag," she says, and turns to leave, leaving me standing in the middle of the sidewalk. I stay there for a few seconds, the wind cutting my face, the trees creaking slightly above me. I absorb what she said, and the feeling that they left that with me on purpose. I decide that thing will not ride with me anymore. I will not give a ride to this thing. I go back to the taxi, take another deep breath, and open the back door. The mannequin remains sitting there, motionless, but I swear to God that I feel something heavy in the air, as if it had just moved before I opened the door. I pull it out with an absurd force, it seems heavier than it should, and leave it there on the sidewalk, leaning against the pole. I don't care anymore. I get in the car, turn on the engine, and drive away without looking in the rearview mirror. But of course, it doesn't end there. That night, around 3 a.m., I wake up to a faint noise coming from the street. A sound of plastic scratching the ground, something being dragged. I get out of bed slowly, heart racing. I look out the bedroom window. In front of my house, leaning against the gate, the mannequin, assembled, sitting with that same crooked smile and eyes fixed on the door of my house. Perfectly assembled, leaning against the gate of my house, the same rigid smile, those painted eyes fixed on the front door. It almost seems as if it waited for me to get to the window to make sure I saw. I feel a weight on my chest, difficult to explain, a chill down my spine that has nothing to do with the temperature outside. I close the curtain and retreat, not knowing exactly what to do. I turn on all the lights in the house, as if that would help. I stay seated in the living room, watching the door, waiting for the sun to rise. I don't sleep for a minute. When it dawns, I take courage. I open the door with a knot in my stomach. The mannequin is still there, motionless, but the feeling is that it moved during the night, as if it had tried to enter and gave up at the last second. I decide it's enough. I'm not going to wait for luck anymore. I carry it back to the taxi, and I swear it seems heavier now, and drive straight to the place where I left that woman on the first night. Ladd's Addition. The streets are empty. The cold wind sweeps the leaves across the ground. The place seems more abandoned than before, as if each house had been empty for years, not just one night. I drive slowly, looking at the sidewalks, trying to find any sign of her. And almost as if she was waiting for me, I see the figure coming from the other side of the street. Long coat, slow walk. It's her. I park, get out of the car, and go straight to the point. "Ma'am, this is not mine. I brought it back. I don't want it anymore." She stops, looks at me for a moment, then averts her gaze to the mannequin sitting in the back seat. "I tried," she says with a scratchy voice, almost without emotion. "I thought if I left him with someone else, maybe he would stop following me." I stand there processing. What is this? Why does it keep coming back to me? She looks at the ground as if she were too tired to explain again. "My daughter thought she could bring her father back. She looked for people who mess with that stuff. They did a ritual, used the mannequin, but what came back wasn't him. It was something that got stuck. It never left." She raises her eyes and faces me finally. "It's no use throwing it away. It's no use trying to return it. He already knows where you live." That gives me a knot in my stomach. I stand there looking back at the mannequin, feeling a huge emptiness, as if I had heard the sentence of something inevitable. She turns and continues walking, disappearing down the empty street. I don't look at her anymore. It's no use. That night, I don't go back home. I drive through the city aimlessly, the mannequin back there, quiet, but its presence heavier than ever. I try to think of any solution. Stop at the police, throw it in the river, abandon the car, but every time I think of these options, a part of me knows that it won't help, as if something had already stuck to me since that first ride. I don't drive at night anymore after that. I sold the taxi a few weeks later. I changed houses, changed my number. I didn't tell almost anyone. Only those who are very close know. And even then, I avoid going into details. It's hard to explain properly. I only know that from time to time, passing by some half-empty street in Portland, in the reflection of a shop window or mirror, I'm sure I see something back there, in the back seat. Always that forced smile. My name is Andrew. I've been working as a taxi driver for years here in Chicago, mostly the night shift. I've seen all sorts of strange things on the city streets, but this story, it was the only time I had to stop driving for a while. It was a cold, early morning, a common thing around here in the fall. I had just dropped off 2 passengers near the Greyhound station when a man approached the car window. Tall guy, kind of scruffy looking, and asked if I was free. "Yeah, sure." "Where to?" I asked. He gestured with his head, saying he just needed to pick up his mom around the corner, and then he would give me the address. I thought it was normal. He went to a somewhat dim house, and when he came back, he was carrying an old lady in his arms. Real old. Her head slumped on his shoulder, seemed like she was sleeping. He carefully put her on the back seat, sat down next to her, and gave me an address in the Bridgeport neighborhood. We drove quietly for a few minutes, but halfway there, he asked me to stop at a 24-hour pharmacy. He said he needed to buy some urgent medicine for his mom. "All right, but the meter keeps running, okay?" "No problem, I'll be right back," he replied. He got out quickly and disappeared inside. While I was waiting, I looked in the rearview mirror. The lady was there, quiet, leaning against the glass, eyes closed. It didn't seem strange to me immediately. The night was cold. She seemed fragile, maybe she was just sleeping. Time went by. First 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. I started to get impatient. Pharmacy isn't a place to take that long. I kept watching, but he didn't come out. That's when, without warning, I heard a faint voice coming from the back seat. "He won't be back." I looked in the rearview mirror. It was the lady. Her eyes still closed, face pressed against the glass. That gave me the creeps all over. I didn't answer anything, I just kept quiet. I waited a few more minutes, but the guy didn't show up. I decided to get out and ask the pharmacy staff if they had seen him. The clerk said yes, that he came in, but left through the side door a long time ago. I went back to the car, tried to wake up the lady, to explain that her son had left without paying, but she didn't respond, didn't react. That's when I realized the worst. She wasn't breathing. My heart raced. I called the police right away, explained the situation. They arrived quickly, and it was there, in the middle of that cold street, with the flashing lights of the patrol car illuminating everything, that the policeman told me, "Son, this lady has been dead for hours. There's no way she could have talked to you a moment ago." I gave my formal statement. They told me later that they managed to locate the son, a guy with a history of mental problems who simply didn't know what to do with his mother's body and used me as a means of transportation. I never managed to forget that moment, that calm, weak voice, telling me he wouldn't be back, coming from someone who, officially, was no longer alive. I stopped driving for a few weeks. Sometimes, when I pull over late at night, I still feel like there's someone breathing in the back seat. My name is Kevin. I live in New Orleans, and I've been working as a taxi driver here for about 7 years. I don't usually believe much in ghost stories. I'm not the superstitious type, but what happened that night still gives me the chills when I remember it. It was a hot August night. My hours vary, but on this specific day I was already wrapping up the shift and going home when I saw a neighbor of mine, Mrs. Helen, waving desperately on the corner of our street. Mrs. Helen is a widowed lady, well known in the neighborhood, always friendly. Next to her was her already very old mother, sitting in a wheelchair. On the other side, a tall woman with long hair, who I thought was a relative, maybe a daughter or niece. I stopped the car and Mrs. Helen practically begged, "Kevin, please, can you take my mother to the hospital? She's not feeling well, I'm desperate." I didn't think twice. I got out, helped to carefully put her mother in the back seat. Mrs. Helen sat next to her, and the other woman got in right after, silent, without saying a word. She just stared ahead, her hands resting in her lap, very pale. I thought it was strange, but I figured she must be nervous about the situation. I drove quickly to Memorial Hospital, the closest one. During the ride, Mrs. Helen took care of her mother, trying to help with an inhaler. Her mother was breathing with difficulty, moaning softly, and the car radio was off, so you could only hear the labored breathing and the muffled sound of the city in the background. But there was something that bothered me. The other woman didn't say anything, didn't look at Mrs. Helen nor at me. She just stared fixedly at the windshield with that pale, almost expressionless face. Her posture was too strange, rigid, like someone posing for an old photo. We arrived at the hospital. I got out quickly to open the door and help take her mother out of the wheelchair. Mrs. Helen thanked me hastily and went straight into the hospital, pushing her mother. But then I noticed something. The other woman walked behind them, silently, like a shadow. Didn't even look at me, didn't ask for help, didn't say anything. She just followed, head held high, looking straight ahead. I didn't worry too much at the time. After all, emergency, tense atmosphere. I thought it was normal. The next day, I left home early to pick up the morning shift. Almost at the same time I arrived at the car, I see Mrs. Helen returning home by taxi. I greeted her and asked, worried, "How's your mother? Did she get better?" She looked at me sadly, her eyes watery. "No, Kevin. My mother passed away in the early morning." I was speechless for a second. I offered my condolences, and she began to vent, saying that she had to resolve everything alone because none of her sisters could come that night. And that's when something didn't add up. I asked half without thinking, "But what about that other woman who was with you yesterday? I thought she was your sister or relative." Mrs. Helen looked at me confused. "What woman, Kevin? It was just me and my mother. You know I don't have daughters," I insisted, describing the woman. Tall, thin, long hair, rigid posture, didn't say anything the whole way. She only got paler, almost irritated. "Kevin, we were alone. I swear to God." I kept quiet at the time. I didn't want to insist. I said goodbye quickly and went to work, but all day I couldn't get the face of that woman out of my head, as if she knew I was watching, as if she was there, but not to help. The strangest thing. A few weeks later, Mrs. Helen invited me to her house for coffee. In the living room, she had old family photos spread out, and there she was, the woman who got into my taxi that night. Young, serious, elegant, the same hair, the same fixed gaze. I asked who she was. Mrs. Helen replied without hesitation, "My Aunt Evelyn. She died in 1965. She and my mother were inseparable." I felt a chill down my spine at that moment. I didn't ask anything else. I just finished my coffee, thanked her, and left. Since that night, I have never doubted that some people come back, just to accompany someone on their final journey. My name is Jason. I live in Detroit, and I've been working as a taxi driver for about 8 years. I've picked up every strange passenger you can imagine. But there's one fare that still bothers me to this day. It was on a cloudy winter afternoon near the end of my shift. I was driving around on the west side of the city when a lady flagged me down near a flower shop. She seemed calm, well-dressed, with a serious face. She asked me to take her to a funeral home nearby, about 15 minutes away. During the ride, she remained silent, just looking out the window. She was carrying a brown leather bag, kind of worn out, and seemed too thoughtful. I tried to make conversation, but she only responded with a short smile, like someone with their head in the clouds. We arrived at the funeral home, and she paid me correctly. She got out quickly, almost without looking back. I stayed in the car, answering some messages on my cell phone before leaving. That's when I noticed. In the back seat, the brown bag she was carrying was still there. I thought it was strange, got out of the car, and went into the funeral home to try to catch up with her. Inside, the atmosphere was silent, heavy, that smell of flowers and candles lingering in the air. I saw some people gathered near a coffin in the main hall, but I didn't find the lady. No sign of her in the lobby, at the reception, nothing. As I was walking out, I passed a table where there were some old photos. I couldn't help but stop to look at one of them. It was a black and white photo of an elegant gentleman, hat, suit. It looked like one of those formal photos from the old days. And next to him was her, the same woman I had just dropped off there. I didn't think much, just decided to leave the bag with someone at the reception, thinking it was just my imagination. I explained that a lady had forgotten it, described her, but the attendant just gave me a strange look. "Sir, we haven't seen any woman like that come in here today." I was uneasy, but I left, thinking that maybe she had left without me seeing her. I went back to work, continued with the night normally. But then, about 2 hours later, I picked up a passenger near a shopping mall. The guy was about to get in the car, but stopped at the passenger side door and made a strange face. Sorry, I thought you had a passenger." I looked back. The car was empty. I said there was no one. but he hesitated, looking directly at the back seat, kind of disconcerted. I swear I saw someone sitting there now, a gentleman with a hat, serious, looking straight ahead. At that moment, the cold went up my spine. The man described exactly the gentleman in the photo I saw at the funeral home. I laughed nervously, said it must have been a reflection, and he ended up giving up on the ride. But I kept thinking about it all night. I never went back to that funeral home. And to this day, when I drive at night, I avoid looking in the rear-view mirror for too long. Who knows, maybe someone is back there, just waiting.